Hi friends, continuing to the chapter How to Win Friends and Influence People. 6 ways to make people like you. Robert Sire, a manager of a computer department for a Ohio company, told how they had successfully found the right applicant for a hard to fill position. I was desperately trying to recruit a PhD in computer science for my department. I finally located a young man with ideal qualification who was about to be graduate from Purdue University. After several phone conversations, I learned that he had several offers from other companies, many of them larger and better than that mine. I was delighted when he accepted my offer. After he started on the job, I asked him why he had chosen us over the others. He paused for a moment and he said, I think it was because managers in the other company spoke on the phone in a cold, business like manners, which made me feel like just another business transactions. Your voice sounded as if you were glad to hear from me, that you really wanted me to be a part of your organization. You can be assured. I'm still answering my phone call with a smile. The chairman of the board of the directions of one of the largest rubber companies in the United States told me that, according to this observation, people rarely succeed at anything unless they have fun doing it. This industrial leader, unless they have fun doing it, this this industrial leader doesn't put much faith in the old age that work hard alone in the magic key that will unlock the door to our desires. I have no people, he said, who succeed because they have a ripe, roaring good times conducting their business. Later, I saw those people change as the fun became work. The business have grown dull. They lost all the joy in it and they failed. You must have a good time meeting people if you expect them to have a good time meeting you. I have asked thousands of business questions people to smile at someone's every hour of the day for a week and then come to the classes and talk about the results. How did it work? Let's see. Here is a letter from William B., a New York stockbroker. His case isn't it isolated. In fact, it is a typical of hundreds of cases. I have been married for over 18 years, wrote Mr. Steinhardt, and in all the time I have seldom smiled at my wife or spoke 2 dozen words to her from the time I got up until I was ready to leave for the business. I was one of the worst grouches who ever walked down Broadway. When you asked me to make a talk about my experience with the smiles, I thought I would try it for a week. So the next morning, while combing my hair, I looked at my glum mug in the mirror and I said to myself, Bill, you are going to wipe the skull off that spore pass of your today. You are going to smile and you're going to begin right now. As I sat down to the breakfast, I greeted my wife with a good morning, dear, and smiled as I said it. You warned me that she might be surprised. Well, you underestimated her reaction. She was bewildered. She was shocked. I told her that in the future she could expect this as a regular occurrence, and I kept it up every morning. This changed attitude of my mind brought more happiness into our home in the last 2 months since I started than there was during the last year. As I leave for my office, I greet the elevator operator in the apartment house with a good morning and smile. I greet down with a smile and smile at the cashier in the subway booth when I ask for a change. As I stand on the floor of the stock exchanges, I smile at the people who until recently never saw me smile. I soon found that everybody was smiling back at me. I treat those who comes to me with a complaint or grievance in a cheerful manner. I smiles as I listen to them and I find their adjustments are accomplished much easier. I find that smiles are bringing me dollars, many dollars every day. I share my office with another broker. One of his clerk is a likable young chap and I was so elated about the result I was getting that I told him recently about my new philosophy of human relations. He then confessed then when I came first to share my office with his friend, he thought he may be a terrible growth and only recent changed his mind. He said I was really human when I smiled. I have also eliminated criticisms for my system. I give appreciation and praise now instead of commanding. I have stopped talking about what I want. I am now trying to see the other person's point of view, and these things have literally revolutionizing my life. I am a totally different man, a happier man, a richer in friendship and happiness. The only thing that matters much after all. You don't feel like smiling. Then what? Two things. First, force yourself to smile. If you're alone, force yourself to whistle or hum a tune of sing. Act as if you were already happy and that will tends you make happy. Here is the way the psychologist and the philosopher William James put in. Action seems to follow feelings, but really actions and feelings go together, and by regulating the actions, which is under the more direct control of the will, we can indirectly regulate the feelings, which is not. Thus, the sovereign volunteer parts of cheerfulness, if our cheerfulness be lost, is to sit up cheerfully and not to act and speak as if cheerfulness were already there. Everybody in this world is seeking happiness, and there is one sure way to find it. That is by controlling your thoughts. Happiness doesn't depends on outward conditions. It depends on inner conditions. It isn't what you have or what you are or where you are or what you are doing that makes you happy or unhappy. It is what you think about it. For example, two people may be in the same place doing the same things. Both may have about a equal amount of money and prestige, and yet one may be miserable and other happy. Why? Because of a different mental attitudes. I have seen just as many happy faces among the poor peasant toileting with their primitive tools in the devastating heats of tropics as I have seen in air conditioned office in the New York, Chicago or Los Angeles. There is nothing either good or bad, said Shakespeare, but thinking makes it so. Abraham Lincoln once remarks that most folks are about as happy as they make up their minds to be. He was right. I saw a vivid illustration of the truth as I was waking up the stairs of Long Island Railroad Station in the New York. Directly in the front of me, 30 or 40 crippled boys on the canes and the crutches were struggling up the stairs. One boy had to be carried up. I was astonished at their laughter and gently I spoke about it to one of the men in charge of the boys. Oh, yes, he said. When a boy realizes that he is going to be a cripple for a life, he is shocked at first. But after he gets over the shock, he usually resigns himself to his fate and then become as happy as a normal boy. I felt like taking my hat off to those boys. They taught me a lesson I hope I shall never forget. Working all by oneself in a closed off rooms in an office not only in lonely but it denies one the opportunity of making friends with other employees in the company. Sinora Maria, a Mexican, had such a job. She involved the share comradeship of other people in the company as she heard her chatter and laughter. As she passed them in the hall during the first week of her employment, she shyly looked the other way. After a few weeks, she said to herself, Maria, you can't expect those women to come to you. You have to go and meet them. The next time she walked to the water cooler, she put on her brightest smile and said, Hi, how are you today? To each of the people she met. The effect was immediate. Smiles and hellos were returned. The hallway seemed brighter, the job friendlier. Acquaintanceships developed and some ripened into friendship. Her job and her life became more pleasant and interesting. Pursue this bit of a sage advice from the essayist and publisher Elbert Herbie, but remember, pursuing it won't do you any good unless you apply it. Whenever you go out of doors, draw the chin in, carry the crown on the head high, and fill the lungs to the utmost. Drink in the sunshine, greet your friends with a smile, and put souls in every hand claps. Do not fear being misunderstood and do not waste a minute thinking about your enemies. Try to fix firmly in your mind that you would like to do, and then without veering off directions, you will move straight to the goal. Keep your mind on the great and splendid things you like to do, and then as the days goes giggling away, you will find yourself unconsciously seizing upon the opportunities that are required for the fulfillment of your desire. Just as a coral insect taken from the running in tide the element it's needed. Picture in your mind the able, earnest, useful person you desire to be, and the thought you hold is hardly transforming you into the particular individuals. Thought is supreme. Perceive a right mental attitude, the attitude of courage, frankness, and good cheer. To think right is to create. All things come through desire, and every sincere prayer is answered. We became like that on which our hearts are fixed. Carry your chin in and crown of your head high. We are good in the chrysalis. The ancient Chinese were a wise lot, wise in the ways of the world, and they had a proverb that had I ought to cut out and paste inside our hat. It goes like this: a man without a smiling face must not open a shop. Your smile is a messenger of your goodwill. Your smile brightens the life of all who sees it. To someone who has seen a dozen people frown, scrawl, or turn their faces away, your smile is like the sun breaking through the clouds. Especially when that someone is under pressure for his bosses, his customers, his teachers, or parents or children, A smile can help him realize that all is not hopeless, that there is a joy in this world. Some years ago, a department store in the New York City, in recognition of the pressure its sales clerk were under during the Christmas rush, presented the leaders of its advertisement with the following homely philosophy: the value of the smile at Christmas. It costs nothing but creates much. It enriches those who receive without improvising those who gives. It happens in a flash, and the moment of it sometimes lasts forever. None are so rich they can get along without it, and none are so poor but are richer for its benefits. It creates happiness in the home, foster goods will in a business, and in countersigns of friends. It is a rest to the weary, daylight to be discouraged, sunshines to the shared, and the nature's best antidote to the troubles. Yet it cannot be bought, begged, borrowed, or stolen, for it sometimes something that is not earthly good to anybody till it is given away. And if in the last time rush of Christmas buying some of our salespeople should be too tired to give you a smile, may we you ask you to leave one of yours. For nobody needs a smile so much as those who have none left to give a smile. If you don't do this, you are headed for trouble. Back in 1898, a tragic things happened in a rock-clad country, New York. A child had died, and on his particular day, the neighbors were preparing to go to the funeral. Jim Fairley went out to the barn of the hitches up his horse. The ground was covered with snow. The air was cold and snaffy. The horse hadn't been excited for cold and snaffy. As he was led out of watering through, he wielded playfully, kicked both his heels high in his hair, and killed Jim Fairley. So the little village of the Stony Point had two funerals that week instead of one. Jim Fairley left behind him a widow and three boys and a few $100 in insurance. His old boy Jim was 10, and he went to the work in the brickyard, wheeling sand and pouring it into the mold and turning the bricks on the edges to be dried by the sun. This boy Jim never had a chance to get much education, but with his natural genetically he had a flair for making people like him. So he went into politics, and as the years went by, he developed an uncanny ability for remembering people's name. He never saw the inside of a high school, but before he was 46 years of age, 4 colleges has been honored him with degrees, and he had become the chairman of a Democratic National Committee and Postmaster General of the United States. I once interviewed Jim Fairley and asked him the secret of his success. He said hard work, and I said don't be funny. He then asked me what I thought was the reason for his success. I replied, I understand you can call 10,000 people by their first names. No, you're wrong, he said. I can call 50,000 people by their first name. Make no mistakes about it. That ability helped Mr. Fairley put Franklin D. Roosevelt in the White House when he managed Roosevelt's campaign in 1932. During the years that Jim Fairley traveled as a salesman for a gypsum concern, and during the years that he held office as town clerk in Stony Point, he built up a system for remembering names. In the beginning, it was very simple one. Whenever he met a new antics, he found out his or her complete names and some facts about his or her family, business, and the political opinions. He fixed all these facts well in a mind as a part of the picture. And the next time he met that person, even if it was a year later, he was able to shake hands, inquire after the family, and ask about the hollyhocks in the backyards. No wonder he developed a following. For a month before Roosevelt's campaign for president began, Jim Farley wrote hundreds of the letters a day to people all over the western and the northwestern states. Then he hopped onto a train and in 19 days discovered 20 states and 12,000 miles traveled by buggy, train, automobiles, and boat. He would drop into the town, meet his people at the lunch or breakfast, tea or dinner, and give them a heart to heart talk. Then he dashed off again on another leg of his journey. As soon as he arrives back east, he wrote to one person in each town he had visited, asking for a list of all the guests to whom he had talked. The final list contained thousands and thousands of names. Yet each person on that list was paid by a subtle flattery of getting a personal letter from James Farley. These letters begin Dear Bill or Dear Jane, and they were all way signed Jim. Jim Farley discovered early in his life that the average person is more interested in his or own name than in all others' names on the earth put together. Remember that name and call it easily. And you have to pay a subtitle and very effective compliments. But forgot it or misspell it, and you have placed yourself at a sharp disadvantages. For example, I once organized a public speaking courses in Paris and sent a form letter to all the American residency in the city. French typists with apparently little knowledge of English filled in the names and naturally they made blunders. One man, the manager of a large American bank in Paris, wrote me a scathing rebuke because his name has been misspelled. Sometimes it is difficult to remember a name, particularly if it is hard to pronounce. Rather than even try to learn it, many people ignore it or call the person by an easy nicknames. Sid Levy called on a customer for some time whose name was Nicodemus Papidonis. Most people just call him Nick. Levy told us, I made a special effort to say his name over several times to myself before I made my call. When I greeted him by his full name, Good afternoon, Mr. Nicodemus Papaloudis, he was shocked. For what seems like several minutes, there was no reply from him at all. Finally, he said with the tears rolling down his cheeks, Mr. Levy, in all these 18 years I have been in this country, nobody had ever made the effort to call me by my right name. What was the reason for Andrew Carne's success? He was called the Steel King, yet he himself knew little about the manufacture of the steel. He had hundreds of the people working for him who knew far more about the steel than he did. But he knew how to handle people, and that is what made him rich. Early in his life, he showed a flair for organization, a genius for leadership. By the time he was 10, he too had discovered the astonishing importance people place on their own name. And he was used that discovery to win a corporation. To illustrate, When he was a boy back in Scotland, he got hold of a rabbit, a mother rabbit, Prusto. He soon had a whole nest of little rabbits and nothing to feed them. But he had a brilliant idea. He told the boys and the girls in the neighborhood that if they would go out and pull enough cover and dandelions to feed the rabbits, he would name the bunyar in their honor. The plan worked like magic, and Kearney never forgot it. Years later, he made a millions by using the same psychology in business. For example, he wanted to sell steel rails to the Pennsylvania Railroads. J. Edgar Thomas was the president of the Pennsylvania Railroads then. So Andrews built a huge steel mills in Pittsburgh and called it in the Edgar Thomas Steel Works. Here is a riddle. See if you can guess it. When the Pennsylvania Railroad needed steel rails, where do you suppose J. Edgar Thompson brought them? From Sears Reeboks? No, you're wrong. Guess again. When Andrews and George Pullman were battling each other for a supremacy in the railroad sleeping car business, the Steel King again remembered the lesson of the rabbit. The Central Transportation Company, with an Andrew controlled, was fighting with the company that Pullman owned, but were struggling to get the sleeping car business of the Union Public Railway Road, bucking each other, slashing prices and destroying all chances of profit. Both Andrews and Pullman had gone to New York to see the board of directions of the Union Pacific. Meeting one evening in St. Nicholas Hotel, Andrews says, "Good evening, Mr. Pullman. Aren't we making a couple of a fool of ourselves?" "What do you mean?" Pullman demanded. Then Andrews expressed that we had on his mind a merge of this two interests. He pictured in glowing terms the mutual advantage of working with instead of against each other. Pullman listened attentively, but he was not wholly convinced. Finally, he asked, "What would you call the new company?" And Andrews replied prominently, "Why, the Pullman Palace Car Companies, of course." Pullman's face brightened. "Come into my room," he said. "Let's talk it over." The talk made industrial history. This policy of remembering and honoring the names of his friendship and the business associates was one of the secrets of Andrews' leadership. He was proud of that fact that he could call many of his factory workers by their first name, and he boasted that while he was personally in charge, no strikes ever disturbed his flaming steel mills. Benton Love, chairman of Texas Commerce Branch Sales, believes that a bigger a corporation gets, the cooler it becomes. One way to warm it up, he said, is to remember people's name. The executives who tells me that he can't remember names is at the same time telling me he can't remember a significant part of the business and is operating on quicksand. Karen Krish of Randopolis, Verdes, California, a flight attendant for TWA, made it a practice to learn the names of as many passengers in her cabin possible and use the name when serving them. This resulted in many compliments on her services expressed both to her directly and to the airlines. One passenger wrote, "I haven't flown to TWA for some time, but I'm going to start flying nothing but TW from now on. You make me feel that your airline has become a very personalized airline, and that is important to me. People are so proud of their names that they strive to populate them at any cost. Even blustering, hard boiled, old P.T. Borman, the greatest showman of his time, disappointed because he had no sons to carry on his name, offering his grandson C.H. Shelley $25,000 if he would call himself Borman's Sally. For many centuries, nobles and the magnates supports architects, musicians, and the authors so that their creative works would be dedicated to them. Libraries and the museums over their richest collections to the people who cannot bear to think that the names might perish from the memory of the race. The New York Public Library has its Astor and Lenox collection. The Metropolitan Museums perpetuates that the name of a Belgium Attelsman and J.P. Morgan's, and nearly every church is beautifully by stained glass windows commerciating the names of their donors. Many of the buildings on the campus of most universities bears the names of the donors who contributed large sums of the money for this honor. Most people don't remember names for the simple reason that they don't take the time and energy necessary to concentrate and repeat and fix names indelibly in their minds. They make excuses for themselves, but they are too busy. But they were probably no busier than Franklin D. Roosevelt, and he took time to remember and recall even the names of mechanics with whom he come into the contact. To illustrate, the cycler organization built a special car for Mr. Roosevelt, who could not use a standard car because his legs were paralyzed. W.S. Chamberlain and a mechanic delivered it to the White House. I have in the front of me a letter from Mr. Chamberlain relating his experience. I taught President Roosevelt how to handle a car with a lot of unusual gadgets, but he taught me a lot about the fine art of handling people. When I called at the White House, Mr. Chambers writes, the president was extremely pleasant and cheerful. He called me by the name, made me feel very comfortable, and particularly impressed me with the fact that he was vitally interested in things. I had to show him and tell him. The car was so designed that it could be operated entirely by hand. A crowd gathered around to look at the car, and he remarked, I think it is marvelous. All you have to do is to touch a button and it's move away and you can drive it without effort. I think it is grand. I don't know what makes it go. I would love to have the time to tear it down and see how it works. When Roosevelt's friend and associates admired the machine, he said in their presence, Mr. Chamberlain, I certainly appreciate all the times and efforts you have spent in developing this car. It is a mighty fine job. He admired the radiator, the special rear vision mirror and the clock, the special spotlight, a kind of a upholstery, the sitting position of the driver seat, the special suitcases in the trunk with his monogram on each suitcase. In other words, he took notice of every detail to which he knew I had given considerable thought. He made a point of bringing these various pieces of equipment to the attention of Mrs. Roswell, Miss Perking, the Secretary of Labor, and his secretary. He even brought the old White House portrait into a picture by saying, George, you want to take particularly good care of this suitcase. When the driving lesson was finished, the president turned to me and said, Well, Mr. Chamberlain, I have been keeping the Federal Reserve boats waiting 30 minutes. I guess I had better back to work. I took a mechanic with me to the White House. He was introduced to Roswell when he arrived. He didn't talk to the president, and the Roswell heard his name only once. He was shy chap and he kept in the background. But before leaving us, the president looked for the mechanic, shook his hand, called him by the name, and thanked him for coming to Washington. And there was nothing profoundly about his thanks. He meant what he said. I could feel that. A few days later, returning to the New York, I got an photograph of President Roosevelt and a little note of thanks again expressing his appreciation for my assistance. How he found time to do this, it is a mystery to me. Franklin D. Roosevelt knew that one of the simplest, most obvious, and most important ways of gaining goodwill was by remembering names and making people feel important. Yet, how many of us do it? Half the time we introduce to a stranger, we chat a few minutes and can't even remember his or her name by the time we say goodbye. One of the first lessons a politician learns is this: to recall a voter's name is a statesmanship. To forget it is an oblivion. And the ability to remember names is almost as important in a business and the social contacts as it is in politics. Napoleon III, Emperor of the France and nephew of the great Napoleon, boasted that in spite of all his royal duties, he could remember the names of every person he met. His technique is simple. If he didn't hear the name distinctly, he said, So sorry, I didn't get the name clearly. Then, if it was an unusual name, he would say how it is to be spelled. During the conversation, he took the trouble to repeat the name several times and tried to associate it in his mind with the person's features, expressions, and the general appearance. If the person was awesome of importance, Napoleon went to even further pains. As soon as His Royal Highness was alone, he wrote the name down on a piece of paper, looked at it, concentrated on it, fixed it securely in his mind, and then tore up the paper. In this way, he gained an eye impression of the name as well as ear impression. At this take time, but good manners, said Emerson, are made up of pretty sacrifices. The importance of remembering and using name is not just the prerogatives of kings and corporative executives. It works for all of us. Ken Nottingham, an employee of General Motors in Indiana, usually had a lunch at the company cafeteria. He noticed that a woman who worked behind the counter always had a crawl on her face. She has been making sandwiches for about 2 hours, and I was just another sandwich to her. I told her that I wanted. She weighed out the ham on a little scale. Then she gave me a one leaf of lettuce, a few potato chips, and handed them to me. The next day, I went through the same line, same woman, same skull. The only difference was I noticed her name tag. I smiled and said, "Hello, Eunice," and then told her what I wanted. Well, she forgot the scale, pilled on the ham, gave me 3 leaves of a lettuce, and heaped on the potato chips until they fell off the plate. We should be aware of the magic contained in a name and realize that this single item is wholly and completely owned by the person with whom we are dealing and nobody else. The name sets the individual apart. It makes him or her unique among all others. The information we are imparting or the request we are making takes on a special importance. When we approach the situation with the names of the individuals from the waitress to the senior executive, the name will work magic as we deal with others. Remember that a person's name is to the person the sweetest and the most important sound in any language. An easy way to become a good conversationist. Some times ago, I attended a bride party. I don't play bride, and there was a woman there who didn't play bride either. She had discovered that I had once been Love Thomas' manager before he went on the radio, and that I have traveled in Europe and a great deal while helping him prepare the illustrated travel walks he was then delivering. So she said, "Oh, Mr. Carney, I do want you to tell me about all the wonderful places you have visited and all sights you have seen." As we sat down on the sofa, she remarks that she and her husband had certainly returned from a trip to Africa. "Africa?" I exclaimed. "How interesting! I have always wanted to see Africa, but I have never got there except for 24 hours stay in Algiers." "Tell me, did you visit the big game country?" "Yes." "How fortunate! I envy you. Do tell me about Africa." That keeps her talking for 45 minutes. She never again asked me where I would have been or what I had seen. She didn't want to hear me talk about my travels. All she wanted was an interested listener so she would expand or her ego and tell about where she had been. Was she unusual? Many peoples are like that. For example, I met a distinguished botanist at a dinner party given by a New York book publisher. I had never talked with a botanist before, and I found him fascinating. I literally sat on the edge of my chair and listened while he spoke of exotic plants and experiments in developing new forms of plant life and indoor gardens, and even told me astonishing facts about the humble potatoes. I had a small indoor garden of my own, and he was good enough to tell me how to solve some of my problems. As I said, we were at a dinner party. There must have been a dozen other guests, but I violated all the canons of the courtesy, ignored everyone else, and talked for a honor to the botanist. Midday came. I said good night to everyone and departed. The botanist then turned to our host and paid me several flattering complaints. I was most stimulating, I was this, and I was that. And he ended by saying I was the most interesting conversationalist. An interesting conversationalist? Why, I had said hardly anything at all. I couldn't have said anything if I had wanted to without changing the subject. for I didn't know any more about the botany and I knew about the anatomy of a pigeon. But I had done this. I had listened intimately. I had listened because I was genuinely interested, and he felt it. Naturally, that pleased him. That kind of listening is one of the highest compliments we can pay anyone. Few humans Few human beings, wrote Jack Woodford in Strangers in Love, few human beings are proof against the impelled flattery of a rapt attention. I went even further than giving him a rapt attention. I was hearty in my observations and lavish in my praise. I told him that I have been immensely entertained and instructed, and I had. I told him I wish I had his knowledge, and I did. I told him that I should love to wander the fields with him, and I have. I told him I must see again, and I did. And so I had him thinking of me as a good conversationist when in reality I had been merely a good listener and had encouraged him to talk. What is the secret, the mystery of a successful business interview? Well, according to the former Harvard president Charles W. Eliot, there is no mystery about the successful business intercourse. Exclusively attention to the person who is speaking to you is very important. Nothing else is so flattering as that. Eliot himself was a past master of the art of listening. Henry James, one of America's first great novelists, recalled Dr. Eliot's listening was not mere silence but a form of activity. Sitting very erect on the end of his spine, with hands joined in his lap, making no movement except that he revolved his thumb around each other faster or slower. He faced these interlocutors and seemed to be hearing with his eyes as well as his ears. He listened with his mind and attentively considered what you had to say while you say it. At the end of an interview, the person who had talked to himself felt that he had had his say. Self evident, isn't it? You don't have to study for your 4 years in Harvard to discover that. Yet, I know that you know department store owner who will rent expensive space, buy their goods economically, dress their windows appealingly, spend thousands of dollars in advertising, and then hire clerks who haven't the sense to be good listeners. Clerk who interrupts customers, contradicts them, irritate them, and all but drive them from the store. A department store in Chicago almost lost a regular customer who spends several $1,000s each year in that store because a sales clerk wouldn't listen. Mrs. Douglas, who took our courses in Chicago, had purchased a coat at a special sale. After she had brought it, how she noticed that there was a tear in the lining. She came back the next day and asked the sales clerk to exchange it. The clerk refused even to listen to her complaint. You bought this at a special rate, she said. She pointed to a sign on the wall. Read that, she explained. All sales are final. Once you brought it, you have to keep it. Screw up the lining yourself. But this was a damaged merchandise, Mrs. Douglas complained. Make no difference, the clerk interrupted. Final, final. Mr. Douglas was about to walk out indignantly swearing never to return to that store ever. When she was greeted by the department manager who knew her from her many years of propaganda, Mrs. Douglas told her what had happened. The manager listened attentively to the whole story, examined the coat, and then said, "Special sales are final, so we can dispose of merchandise at the end of the season. But this no return policy does not apply to damaged goods. We will certainly repair or replace the lining, or if you prefer, give you your money back." What a difference in treatment! If that manager has not come along and listened to the customer, a long term pattern of that store could have been lost forever. Listening is just as important in one's home life as in the world of business. Mile Ebstock of Crotons on Dustin, New York, made it her business to listen carefully when one of her children wanted to speak with her. One evening, she was sitting in the kitchen with her son Robert, and after a brief discussion of something that was on his mind, Robert said, "Mom, I know that you loved me very much." Mrs. Epostick was touched and says, "Of course, I love you very much. Did you doubt it?" Robert responded, "No, but I really know you love me because whenever I want to talk to you about something, you stop whatever you're doing and listening to me." The chronic kicker, even the most violent criticist, will frequently soften and be subdued in the presence of a patient, sympathetic listener. A listener who will be silent while the irate fault finder dilates like a king cobra and spews the poison out of his system. To illustrate, the New York Telecom Company discovered a few years ago that it has to deal with one of the most vicious customer who ever cursed a customer service representative. And he did curse. He raved. He threatened her to tear the phone out by its root. He refused to pay certain charges that he declared were false. He wrote letters to the newspaper. He filed innumerable complaints with the Public Service Commission, and he started several suits against the telephone company. At last, one of the company's most skillful troubleshooters was sent to the interview this stormy petrel. The troubleshooter listened and let the tanquarious customers enjoy himself pouring out his tirade. The telephone representative listened and said yes and sympathized with his grievance. He raved on, and I listened for nearly 3 hours. The troubleshooter said as he related his experience before one of the author's classes, "Then I went back and listened more. I interviewed him for 4 times, and before the 4th visit was over, I had become a charter member of an organization he was starting. He called it as a Telephone Subscribers Protective Associations. I am still a member of this organization, and so far as I know, I am the only member in the world today beside." I listened and sympathized with him on every point that he had made during these interviews. He had never had a telephonic representative talking with him that way before, and he became almost friendly. The point on which I went to see him was not even mentioned on the first visit, nor was it monitored on the second or third. But upon the 4th interview, I closed the case completely. He paid all his bills in full. And for the first time in the history of these difficulties, with the telephonic company, he voluntarily withdrew his complaints from the Public Service Commissions. Doubtless, Mr. has considered himself a holy crudibles defending the public rights against the callous exploitations. But in reality, what he had really wanted was a feeling of importance. He got this feelings of importance at first by kicking and complaining. But as soon as he got his feelings of importance from a representative of the company, his imagined grievances vanished into thin air. One morning, years ago, an angry customer stormed into the office of Julian, founder of the DeMailer Woolen Company, which later became the world's largest distributors of the woolens to the tailoring trade. This man owed us a small sum of money. Mr. Dittmer explained to me. The customer denied it, but we know he was wrong. So our credit department had insisted that he pay. After getting a number of letters from our credit department, he packed his grip, made a trip to the Chicago, and hurried into my office to inform me not only that he was not going to pay the bill, but that he was never going to buy another dollar's worth of goods from the Detterman Woolen Company. I listened patiently to all he said to me. I was tempted to interrupt, but I realized that would be a bad policy. So I let him talk himself out. When he finally simmered down and got into a respectful mood, I said quietly, I want to thank you for coming to Chicago to tell me about this. You have done me a great favor, for if our credit department has annoyed you, it may annoy other company good customers, and that would be just too bad. Believe me, I am far more eager to hear this than you are to tell it. That was the last thing in the word he expected me to say. I think he was trifle disappointed because he had come to Chicago to tell me a thing or two, but here I was thanking him instead of scrapping with him. I assured him he would wipe the charges off the book and forgot it, because he was a very careful man with only one account to look after, while other clerks had to look after thousands. Therefore, he was less likely to be wrong than we were. I told him that I understood exactly how he felt and that if I were in his shoes, I should undoubtedly feel preciously as he did. Since he wasn't going to buy from us any more, I recommended some other woolen houses. In the past, we have usually lunched together when he came to Chicago. So I invited him to have a lunch with me this day. He accepted, but when we came back to the office, he placed a large order than ever before. He returned home in a softened mood and wanted to be just as fair with us as we had been with him. Looked over his bills, found one that he has been mislaid, and sent us a check with his apologies. Later, when his wife presented him with a baby boy, he gave his son the middle name of Detmer, and he remained a friend and the customer of the house until his death 22 years afterwards. Thank you.